Greetings, comrades. Listen, whatever goes on 2 legs is an enemy. Whatever goes on 4 legs is a friend. No animal shall wear clothes. No animal shall sleep in a bed. No animal shall drink alcohol. No animal shall kill any other animal. All animals are equal. It's all right. I'm not completely out to lunch. These are the animal commandments from one of the most famous books in the English language, George Orwell's Animal Farm. It's the story of a bunch of animals who throw out their farmer and try to run the farm on their own. It was first published 50 years ago, it's never been out of print since, and it's been translated into hundreds of languages all over the world. You know the one, don't you? It's even been a set book in schools, which is usually the kiss of death, I know, but people still seem to enjoy it. But what you might not know is that a few years after it first appeared, Animal Farm was turned into a really interesting feature-length cartoon.
Old Major had been ailing, and now he had made known there were some things he wanted to say to his fellow animals before it might be too late.
What's so unusual about the film is that it wasn't made in America by Walt Disney or one of the other big Hollywood cartoon makers, but here in Britain by a studio called Halas and Batchelor.
Overthrow this evil tyrant, and we shall be rich and free.
Courage! Revolt!
Today, we're going to hear the story of how the film was made, and we'll be showing you some of the original drawings and designs that we discovered locked away in the Halas and Batchelor archives. Animal Farm does look different to a lot of cartoons you've seen before on Stay Tuned. Some bits are pretty Disney-ish, but the whole thing's much more dark-looking. And although it has some good gags in it, it's definitely more serious than Yogi Bear or Roadrunner.
I think there's just a general ambience of the film was like terribly sort of grey, and all the colours were sort of grey, and you know, it's like no Cold Comfort Farm, definitely.
We'll also hear from veteran actor Maurice Denham, who, believe it or not, did every single voice and animal sound in the entire film.
For instance, old Napoleon gets very angry and he goes... See, which is essential. I mean, you can't do it going... like that, can you?
It's a lie. I'll promise you a 4-day week.
Bosh!
Perhaps a 3-day week.
Nonsense!
A 1-day week.
So who were Halas and Batchelor? Well, John Halas was born in Hungary. He studied with tutors from the famous Bauhaus School of Design and came to Britain in 1936. Joy Batchelor was from Watford and studied at the world-famous Watford School of Art. Actually, it's not really world-famous, but it's very big in Watford. Anyway, the two of them met at the beginning of the war, and in 1940 started making commercials for things like Kellogg's and Lux and Rinso.
Gosh, it's all right.
Good morning, Mr. Bear. Nice day?
But I thought you'd still be at breakfast.
Breakfast? What a breakfast! Mr. Bear, you solved my life's problem. You brought the wrong groceries. Look. Kellogg's cornflakes. It's called the 30-second breakfast because it only takes 30 seconds to serve. Taste it.
At this time, the Second World War was on, and someone in the Ministry of Information must have seen these ads, because pretty soon, John and Joy found themselves drafted into making propaganda films to help the war effort.
Every bit of land must play its part, or we shall go short. So put your garden on war service. If you haven't got a garden, go to your local council office and ask for an allotment.
And here's another dustbin parade. After the war was over, there was a huge celebration called the Festival of Britain. Lots of famous people joined in, painters, writers, engineers, architects, and Halas and Batchelor made a special series of cartoons for it called The Poet and the Painter. They used the work of some of the most famous artists of the time, like Henry Moore and Mervyn Peake, who wrote Gormenghast. A lot of animators find one style and flog it to death for years and years, but John and Joy weren't like that. They were always experimenting. In 1953, they made two really unusual films. This one's called The Owl and the Pussycat. It was originally a 3D cartoon, so put on a pair of those daft glasses, OK? But if you haven't got any, you'll just have to watch the flat version, because 3D doesn't work on TV without the glasses.
The owl looked up to the stars above and sang to a small guitar. Oh, lovely pussy, oh, pussy, my love, what a beautiful pussy you are. What a beautiful pussy you are.
Wow, wasn't that fantastic? Anyway, John and Joy's other 1953 experiment was a puppet film called The Figurehead. It was based on a poem and had music by a composer called Matthias Seiber. Like John Halas, he was from Hungary, and he'd go on to write the music for lots of Halas and Batchelor films, including Animal Farm. At the same time as they were making these films, Halas and Batchelor began work on their biggest project yet, Animal Farm. George Orwell's book was a satire, in other words, a story that uses an imaginary setting to make a point about real life. The story begins when the animals decide to get rid of Farmer Jones, the cruel and drunken tyrant who runs their farm. At first glance, it seems to be an ordinary farmyard tale, doesn't it? But the story Orwell was really telling was about the Russian Revolution that took place in 1917, and the years after it, when different people struggled for power in the new communist Russia. What he did was to turn all the major personalities of the revolution into pigs. For instance, there's Napoleon, who's really Joseph Stalin, the tyrannical dictator who came to power a few years after the revolution. There's Snowball, who is Leon Trotsky, the opposition leader who was killed on Stalin's orders. And there's Old Major, who is obviously... No, he's not. He's a combination of the two great fathers of the Russian Revolution, Marx and Lenin. There's also lots of images in the story that are meant to remind us of what went on in the revolution, like the singing of the famous International Workers' Hymn. I've got to admit I'm still a sucker for that kind of stuff. Anyway, what begins to happen on the farm is that as time goes by, the pigs take more and more power and start to change the rules to suit themselves. Soon, the pigs are behaving just like the corrupt human beings they threw out. This, of course, is exactly what Orwell thought of the ruling party in Russia, which was called the Bolsheviks. They started out with the right ideas, but before too long, they were as bad as the people they'd overthrown. So, just as the Bolsheviks started to take all the plum jobs for themselves, so the pigs in Animal Farm move into the farmer's house and start to live a life of luxury. They even alter their most sacred commandment, all animals are equal, to all animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. So how did Halas and Batchelor come to make this incredibly political story into an animated film? Well, the idea came from an American producer called Louis de Rochemont, who wasn't involved in animation, but actually had a background in newsreels.
It came from him, I think, the idea of making the film. It was an anti-communist story. That was the big thing, I think, from the American point of view. Although we didn't realise at the time, we just thought it was a story about a farm.
But there are some people who say that the cash really came from the CIA, that's the US intelligence and spy organisation, who had a rather sinister habit of secretly putting money into films which could be used as propaganda against communism.
It was a first. I think it came about solely as a result of, the Cold War. And if it hadn't been for the Cold War, they wouldn't have been made.
Outwardly, Animal Farm appeared prosperous, but the animals themselves were no better off, with the exception of the pigs and their supreme leader, Napoleon.
It was all Ministry of Information. It was all, I think that's why they were so good at putting that kind of story together. They had experience of doing that. I think any other studio would have had more difficulty. But because it was Halas and Batchelor, and they'd done all those propaganda films, I mean, they had very good writers. I think that helped them to get that film together.
Whatever we produce is taken from us, stolen from us, and sold.
They were determined that the whole argument of the film should be clear, clean and uncluttered. They made sure that the animals weren't shown in a sentimental way, and they simplified the story so that some of the characters from the book disappeared altogether. So now, Halas and Batchelor began to assemble the huge team needed to make a feature-length film. One of the key people in the production was animator Harold Whittaker.
Halas and Batchelor was before Animal Farm. I don't know very much about it, but it was a relatively small unit with a very big reputation for doing well-designed and professional films, but obviously they hadn't got the capacity to do a thing like Animal Farm, so a lot of people had to be recruited. I think they'd been on it for a year and a half, 2 years before we came into it. So all the story was worked out. It had been broken down into scenes. They had the sort of knowledge, the overall knowledge of what the film was going to turn out like. On day-to-day animation problems, John Reed, the animation director, we dealt with, and he was always concerned with the mood of a particular scene. And this is what we tried to capture.
Comrades, our leader, as wise as he's beloved, has decided to trade with the outside world. Not for gain, of course. That would be unworthy of our noble principles.
I would go up to London and collect a few scenes and spend the day discussing these scenes with him. And I would come back to Stroud and sleep on it. And the next day I'd start animating. You don't bother much about drawing details, but you just put the main volumes in and get the timing. And then that's shot. That is shot as a pencil drawing, and you look at it, and if it looks reasonable, then you send it up to the director, who looks at it, and he would send back sweatbox notes, which was a Disney term for director's comments on the scene that you'd done. To begin with, they were quite long corrections, and he'd send this back to you and you would redo your animation, and that would be shot again, and if that was okay, he would say okay for ink, and then it would go to tracing and painting and eventually to the camera. This comes from just before the first fight. After Jones has been chased off the farm, he goes to the pub and recruits some fellow farmers who come back with various pitchforks and things with the intention of chucking the animals out of the farm. To avoid excessive work, some of the characters repeat. Some of them are the same. Again, this chap is the same as this chap, but with a different hairstyle. Because you don't have time to look at individual farmers, you just get a general effect of a group. Well, at the beginning, we had these human characters, and to try and get the drawing right, I posed for some positions of various characters, and these were positions in the first fight where one of the characters was jabbing at the others with a pitchfork. Human characters are always a problem, really, because the slightest thing you do wrong, and it shows, because everybody is very familiar with people's body language and the way they walk, and you have to know how to walk a human about in the correct mechanical way. The way you transfer your weight from the back foot to the front foot and so on is quite a critical sort of action. You notice immediately if you get it wrong.
Although the director of animation, John Reed, had worked for Disney, the film they ended up with was a million miles from what Uncle Walt would have done.
The only Disney-ish character was the little duck, which appeared once or twice, which was, I think it was John Reed's idea. He came in as a sort of comedy turn once or twice, a little yellow duckling. Yes, the main pigs were all very definite characters. Napoleon particularly was a brutal type.
The revolution is now complete. We have no more use for that song. Singing it is now forbidden, under penalty of death.
The sound and dialogue were different from Disney too. Instead of a cast of thousands, there was one man's voice, the actor Maurice Denham.
I first met John and Joy. At the time I was in a radio show called Much Binding of the Marsh, which you might have heard of. I had a wonderful time in Much Binding, of course, because there was Dickie Murdoch and Kenneth Horne and Sam Coster, and I had to play all the others, Dudley Davenport and the vicar, old Farmer Giles, the sexton. Then, when he was doing Animal Farm, he wanted some of the animals done, so he asked me along to do the pigs. And then he said, what about doing the chickens as well? And what about the sheep? and the Soundberg had a wonderful way with the sheep and the pigs and so on. I did about 3 different pigs, or 3 different chickens, and then he would overlay it, one after the other, hundreds and hundreds. So he finished up with a great herd of sheep. The interesting one was to try and find different voices for 4 pigs. I mean, it was a question of trying out the various ideas. The first one we did was we did the entire film simply with animal voices. No attempt to dialogue and anything like that, and using subtitles. That seemed ideal because, I mean, if it went, when it was done abroad and so on, they could change the language. And then they thought for local and American consumption it was not good. The second lot was still the very animal sound, but in an endeavour to be recognisable dialogue. It wasn't a success, really, because one can think what you're saying are the right words, but if they're mixed up with a something like that, they become something totally different.
Comrades!
The last one was the actual post-syncing. All the animation had been done, and the dialogue had to fit the picture by then, because that was the point of no return from the point of view of the actual animation. That was it. If you're thinking right, your whole body goes into that character, including your face. And if you're having any emotions with the character, for instance, old Napoleon gets very angry and he goes... See, which is essential. I mean, you can't do it going... Can you?
My dear.
Old Major was this lovely old pig, and I just did the appropriate voice for him.
I have had much time for thought as I lay alone in my stall.
And then I was tackled for saying I was doing an imitation of Winston Churchill, which had never occurred to me at all. There was terrific correspondence about whether it should be allowed to be done like that. And John Halas and Joy eventually said, "Come on, let's keep it in. You know, he may enjoy it." I don't know what his reaction was.
I've said that Maurice Denham provided all the voices, but that's not quite true. The narration was spoken by Gordon Heath. His voice sounds a bit plummy and old-fashioned nowadays, but you've got to remember that that's how newsreaders sounded then. So to a 1950s audience, it would have seemed like the voice of authority.
The very next morning, sooner perhaps than old Major would have predicted, the animals found their situation quite unbearable.
That voice does sound flat to us nowadays, but the music's still pretty atmospheric, isn't it? Matthias Seiber's score may be quite chunky and heavy, but producer Louis de Rochemont didn't seem to mind that. What he did have a problem with was the book's ending, which is: the creatures outside looked from pig to man, and from man to pig, and from pig to man again. But already it was impossible to say which was which. Well, when the time came to film the end of the story, there was a big argument between John and Joy and de Rochemont. The producer wanted a happy ending, in which the animals fight back against the pigs. Halas didn't like the idea, but in the end he was forced to compromise. So how does the film stand up today, over 40 years since it was made? Here's Bob Godfrey, one of Britain's best-known animators, who was starting his career when Animal Farm was being made.
I don't think George Orwell would have, had he been alive, would have settled for that and wouldn't have wanted that. And the Russians, of course, were deeply incensed, and some people in America too. So I think it's a sort of ending that doesn't really satisfy anybody. And it's almost like a put down of George Orwell, really, because the ending in Orwell is everything.
Seeing a film and reading a book is totally different. A film works up to a climax, and I think the climax, as it was in the book, would have been terribly downbeat.
It's funny, isn't it? George Orwell's book ends with Stalin's dictatorship well and truly in place and no hope of it ever being overthrown. But it's the film that actually prophesies the events that took place in the early 1990s, when all over Eastern Europe, ordinary people rose up against Stalinist dictatorships. De Rochemont may only have insisted on a happy ending because he wanted a hit at the box office, but he did seem to get things more or less right, didn't he?
I suppose it comes down to the direction. John Halas, he was the driving force. If he said something, you think, well, we can't do this. It's never going to work. You know, it's ridiculous. If he said it was okay, you said it was going to be okay, then that was all right. You did it, and it worked. You know?
Animal Farm had a pretty good reaction both from the critics and the public when it was first released. There was lots of merchandising, which was quite unusual for the time, like these special china figures made of the characters. And the story was even serialised as a strip cartoon in a lot of newspapers. Halas and Batchelor planned several other big feature films, including a cartoon version of John Bunyan's famous story, A Pilgrim's Progress. But sadly, it never got made, which is a pity because I'd like to have seen that one. But in the early 1960s, they did get another big production off the ground. The very first cartoon opera, a version of Gilbert and Sullivan's Ruddigore. One of my favourite Halas and Batchelor cartoons from that time is Automania 2000. Like Animal Farm and a lot of their other work, it uses humour to make a serious point about the real world. In this case, the effect of too many motor cars. It now looks horribly true.
A new structure of civilization is already apparent.
I mean, we saw it then, we thought, yeah, well, that's the way it's going, you know, but I mean, it's actually coming true. You know, cars piled on top of one another, people living in their cars. It looked good as well. I mean, it was very, very well made in the Halas way. And totally ahead of its time then, but what it said is certainly being, you know, coming to pass.
But Halas and Batchelor were always ahead of their time. Animal Farm may not be everybody's cup of tea, but for my money, it's still one of the most interesting and unusual animated films ever to have been made here or in any other country.
But wherever they were having a bad time, animals listened with interest.
So remember, 4 legs good, 2 legs bad. Stay tuned.